This is a Parks Canada production. Ce balado est aussi disponible en français.
July 15, 1940, St. Paul de l'Île-aux-Noix, Quebec. Joseph Gosselin, a ferryboat operator, is watching a summer storm hit the Richelieu River and the island of Île-aux-Noix. It's been almost a year since Canada entered the Second World War, but things have been relatively quiet in this part of the world. Gosselin normally spends his July days transporting locals the short distance to the island for picnics near Fort Lennox National Historic Site. But tonight, there's a knock on his door. He's shocked to find a group of military officials demanding his boat to take nearly 300 dangerous prisoners of war to be locked up in the old fort. The soldiers encircle the boat with barbed wire, then load the prisoners in batches of 35 men for the crossing. Gosselin asks the soldiers to point their rifles away from him as he pilots the boats back and forth throughout the long, uneasy night. What he couldn't have known was that many of those supposedly dangerous prisoners were actually European Jewish refugees who'd escaped the Nazis.
But to be incarcerated by people who you think are your friends because they think you are your enemy, well, that's what I call a typical Jewish Lemuel story.
I'm your host, Fred Shepard, and you're listening to ReCollections, the Accidental Immigrants of Fort Lennox. Parks Canada is known worldwide as a leader in nature conservation, but we do much more than that. Together with our partners, we commemorate the people, places, and events that have shaped the place we now call Canada. Join us to meet experts from across the country as we explore the sites, stories, and artifacts that bring history to life. In the summer of 1940, as the Second World War raged in Europe, British authorities reached out with a special request for their Canadian allies to accept a number of ships of captured German spies and prisoners of war. The military began preparing a network of internment camps across eastern Canada, including at Fort Lennox, an isolated island stronghold linked to the War of 1812.
They remembered coming into the old fort and masses of bats flying all over the place where they figured nobody had cleaned it since 1813.
We arrived on the Île-aux-Noix, this old fortress with the dank, damp dungeons there. We had to wear uniforms with a big red circle on the back and the red stripes so that if we should manage to escape, they could shoot us more easily.
Among the captured combatants was an unexpected group of prisoners. Thousands of German and Austrian Jews, refugees who'd escaped the Nazi regime for a safer life in England, only to be swept up in a societal panic that saw them labeled as enemy aliens, potential threats to the British Empire. 2,300 Jewish men and teenage boys were detained in Canadian internment camps during the Second World War, and more than 800 of them spent time at Fort Lennox.
We thought it's a huge mistake, and in a few weeks they're going to straighten it all out. And then came that surprise announcement that we were being shipped to some distant country. We were promised freedom after being incarcerated in England, but the commanding officer said the only way that you can stay in Canada is 6 feet under the ground.
Before it was an internment camp, Fort Lennox had a long history as a military fort. Located on Île-aux-Noix, or Walnut Island, named for the abundance of walnut trees that once covered its 210 acres, it's about 60 kilometers southeast of Montreal and 15 kilometers north of the U.S. border. Fortifications on Île-aux-Noix were involved in colonial conflicts like the 7 Years' War, the American Revolution, and the War of 1812. The Richelieu River has been a key trade route for Indigenous peoples for millennia. On Île-aux-Noix, Shards of terracotta pots and animal bones with evidence of hunting and cooking indicate human presence dating back more than 6,000 years. Several different forts were built here during the 17 and 1800s, but the buildings that visitors see today, with a star-shaped moat and earthen walls surrounding 6 stone buildings, were completed in 1829. The fort was named for Charles Lennox, Governor-in-Chief of British North America, who died of a bite from a rabid fox after only a single year in office. By 1920, the military had not used the fort for several decades, and it was among the first places designated a National Historic Site of Canada. The island became a popular spot for afternoon picnicking, but those day trips came to an end during the Second World War, when the military established a nationwide system of internment camps, repurposing many large institutional sites like forts, reform schools, prisons, and asylums. The Department of National Defense transformed Fort Lennox with temporary wooden buildings on the open parade square, high guard towers, and barbed wire fences. The formidable gates of Fort Lennox closed to the outside world, with around 300 internees inside. We spoke with historian Paula Draper about how refugees ended up at Fort Lennox.
I'm Paula Draper. I'm an historian. My focus is on Canadian Jewish history and specifically Canada and the Holocaust. The Nazis came to power in Germany in 1933 and annexed Austria in 1938. That meant that the Jewish populations of both Germany and Austria were now under Nazi control.
The Nazis considered anyone with one Jewish grandparent to be Jewish, even those who were not practicing or did not identify with their Jewish ancestry.
There were a series of discriminatory laws. Jews were unable to go to school, they were barred from various professions, and many of them started to look for a way out of Germany and Austria. In November 1938, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, many Jewish businesses and homes were ransacked, and a large number of Jewish men were interned in German concentration camps.
We're going to transition here and talk a little about the life of Rabbi Erwin Schild, one of the voices you heard in the intro. He was born in Cologne, Germany in 1920 and was held at Fort Lennox as a young man. His story helps us understand how this human tragedy unfolded.
Still, to this day, I meet people who have no clue, who'd never heard of such a thing, that Jews were interned in Canada as enemy aliens.
These recordings come from oral history interviews he gave as part of an international effort to collect testimonies from Holocaust survivors to ensure the world never forgets those events. Shortly after Kristallnacht, Erwin Schild was forcibly taken from his dormitory at the Jewish Teachers Seminary and imprisoned in Dachau concentration camp. He was released 6 weeks later on one condition: that he leave Germany. For a month, he anxiously awaited an exit visa. The situation for Jews was getting worse by the day.
We waited each day for the mailman, as Jews have waited for the Mashiach, for the Messiah. Perhaps today he'll bring the visa. Perhaps today there'll be some news.
The news finally came in January 1939, and by February, he made it to London on a student visa to study at a Jewish school called a yeshiva, leaving his family behind. He was 18.
Responding to the horrors of Kristallnacht, Britain opened its doors to tens of thousands of refugees, both Jewish and political. When they entered Britain, some came as students, some were very young. They went to schools, universities, others went into various forms of employment.
Things changed, though, when Britain entered the war in September 1939.
The British government decided they might have saboteurs among all these refugees, so they started tribunals in which they tried to assess the histories of the people that had come and to determine whether they were in fact dangerous and spies or whether they were innocent refugees.
The tribunal classified Erwin Schild as a friendly enemy alien, along with about 70,000 other refugees. For a short time, they largely went about their lives, working, attending school, worrying about friends and family still in mainland Europe. Then, in the spring of 1940, Germany invaded 6 countries in just 6 weeks: Denmark, Norway, France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands.
When the Germans overran Western Europe, there was panic in Britain. They were concerned that an invasion was imminent. There was a fear that amongst these tens of thousands of refugees, there were some spies, saboteurs, fascists that had not been clearly found by these tribunals.
Rumors of a secret underground army ready to enable a German invasion spread throughout the country.
The British populace, which had been critical of the refugees and looked at them with a jaundiced eye, clamored for the British government to do something. We have thousands of Germans here crawling around, speaking German on the street. And so finally the British government said, "Collar the lot" was the slogan. And so all the German students were interned. We were arrested.
Some are considered friendly enemy aliens, some were considered dangerous enemy aliens, but because they couldn't tell who was who on such a short-term basis, they decided to temporarily intern all of these people who had gone before the tribunals. Most of them were men. So we have, in 1940, in the spring, tens of thousands of German and Austrian Jewish refugees and some Italian Jewish refugees who were interned for what was supposed to be a short time. People were told that they just needed a toothbrush. They'd be home the next day, but that's not what happened. They were sent to various camps on the Isle of Man and around England.
The refugees didn't know it yet, but for most, this was the beginning of a multi-year internment.
We were guarded by British soldiers who had machine guns, also barbed wire surrounded us, and psychologically it was horrible. I remember particularly when we were transported on the bus, when the bus stopped for a traffic light, people shook their hands at us. You know, these are the people, these are the Nazis. That began really that psychological suffering that we underwent, being mistaken for the Nazis that we hated even more than the British hated them.
Officials decided that, friendly aliens or not, refugees were too much of a risk to stay on British soil.
The British government contacted the Canadian and Australian governments and asked if they would be willing to aid the war effort by taking possession of interned, dangerous enemy aliens and prisoners of war.
Canadian Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King agreed, as did the Australian government. In the summer of 1940, Canadian authorities prepared for an influx of ships carrying captured German spies and prisoners of war, or POWs. But many were actually Jewish refugees. Some even ended up on the same ships as their persecutors. One of the ships, the Arendora Star, was torpedoed by German submarines, and over 800 people were killed. When the press revealed that refugees and anti-Nazis were among the dead, public outcry led Britain to limit these deportations to actual prisoners of war. But for the more than 2,000 Jewish refugees whose ships had made it to Canada, there was no clear way back. The ship carrying Erwin Schild, the Sobieski, arrived at Quebec City on July 15, 1940.
Upon our arrival, we were horrified because there really the Canadian Army was prepared to receive very dangerous German prisoners of war. And that's how we were treated. And machine guns all over the place. We had to surrender all belongings. Fortunately, there was a Jewish sergeant from Montreal who was sort of in command of one of the detachments looking after the reception of these prisoners. He saw us coming off the boat, Hasidim with beards and payas and long black coats and so on, Jewish-speaking people and the people who were obviously Orthodox Jews, and he couldn't believe his eyes. He started to talk to us in Yiddish. We told him our story and said, please go to the Jewish community wherever there is and tell them that they're keeping Jewish prisoners in this country, and he promised he would do that, and he did. We found out afterwards that he had gone to the office at his first day off. He went to the offices of the Canadian Jewish Congress in Montreal and told them about the arrival of our group. Meanwhile, while we were being processed, he called out in great voice and high voice, "Surrender all your valuables, your watches and your money. Als Dingen Keschene, was wird behalten in Keschene, wird keiner nicht gefunden." In Yiddish, he told us to keep everything in our pockets because we wouldn't be searched. Whatever we keep in our pockets, we can keep.
From Quebec City, prisoners were sent to camps around Eastern Canada. Eventually, authorities ordered all of the Orthodox Jewish internees who kept the Sabbath and a kosher diet to be housed together at Fort Lennox. That's how Erwin Schild and hundreds of others ended up there. Upon arrival at the fort, the internees were put to work. Here's Parks Canada historian Brigitte Violette.
When the first group of refugees arrived at the fort, the barracks were not properly set up to house them.
Work crews labored to improve the rundown fort and also did maintenance, sanitation, and kitchen tasks. At times, they worked hard to support the wider war effort, manufacturing camouflage nets and training as mechanics. They also built an interior staircase to the second floor of the barracks building, one of the few tangible signs of the internees that still exists at Fort Lennox today. The barracks is where the internees spent most of their time. This imposing two-story limestone building is the largest within the walls of the fort. Designed in 1816 to house nearly 600 soldiers, its exterior features a double stone staircase, 2 rows of neatly arranged windows, and, looming above it all, an oculus window that resembles a giant eye looking out over the grounds. It's the kind of place that gives a sense of order, power, and the regimented lives of the soldiers and internees who once lived there. Inside, the first floor is a wide central hall with vaulted ceilings and a series of alcoves branching off, basically small rooms without doors.
When the fort was transformed into a refugee camp, the second floor of the barrack was used as a dormitory, so it's much like it was used during the garrison the century before. The ground floor was rearranged to include washroom, a kitchen, leisure rooms, and similar services.
Thanks to a hand-drawn sketch by internee Helmut Kallman, we know how the prisoners used these ground floor alcoves. The drawing shows a basic floor plan with a radio room where internees could gather to listen to updates about the war effort. There was also a kosher kitchen and a library, likely used as a beit midrash or a house of study. The internees were aged 16 to 60 and came from a wide range of backgrounds.
It was a real smorgasbord of people, and they learned from each other.
The intellectual level in the internment camp was very high. We had among ourselves outstanding professors from German universities, scientists, poets, writers, so it was not dull.
There were numerous professionals among them who had led rewarding careers in Europe or were attending university in England. So some of these highly educated men gave lectures to the other refugees, and they sort of made like a de facto university.
And here we were in a totally self-contained community with the opportunity of creating for us a religious Jewish community. My yeshiva studies went on. There was some interruption, naturally, but the yeshiva in London kept us supplied with the necessary books and library.
Sometimes there were conflicts.
Religious Jews did not work on Saturday, which was their Sabbath, and this caused conflicts with the camp administration. There was one internee who found an innovative way to avoid work on Saturday. He would refuse to wear the camp uniform, and they'd put him in jail where he could relax for the Sabbath, and then the next day he put on the uniform again.
I was right there when one officer said he really doesn't like his position. He would rather be guarding German prisoners of war who have the decency to stand up for their own country and not like these Jews who betray their country, Germany, or at least pretend that they're enemies of Germany. They were a rabble for them. There was a lot of anti-Semitism.
But the internees knew it could be much worse.
There was no physical suffering for us, especially when we knew the bombs were falling on London. We were safe and sound. We had food, we had shelter, and nothing untoward was going to happen to us. Our suffering was psychological, but it was a very strong suffering. We had no illusions as to what Jews were suffering in those countries that were occupied by Germany, in Poland, in Russia, in the Balkans, and so on. Long before the world woke up to genocide, we knew that genocide was on the German program. So we were fearful for our parents and for anyone whom we had left behind. That is why I call this episode the Canadian footnote to the Holocaust. There was no Holocaust physically, but the psychological deprivation, that was terrible. And the uncertainty as to how the war would end. If we had known that we have to stay in this camp for 2 years and afterwards the Allies will win the war and we'll be liberated, would have been fine. But we didn't know what was going to happen to us.
This mental anguish marked the daily life of internees at Fort Lennox. For nearly a year, they were treated as prisoners of war. For most of this time, refugee rights groups in Britain and Canada protested their treatment with a letter-writing campaign. The federal government bowed to the pressure, and in June 1941, updated their legal status from prisoners of war to refugees.
And then the restrictions were lifted. We could write as much as we wanted. We could get newspapers, we could get radios, and so on. And life became more bearable.
As refugees, they no longer had to wear a uniform and were able to roam freely outside the fortress walls. But they remained under guard and were not allowed to leave the island.
But we couldn't get into Canada. That was out.
To understand why they weren't just released at this point, we talked with a historian of Canadian immigration history.
I'm Harold Troper, a professor emeritus at the University of Toronto.
Dr. Troper is the co-author of the book, None is Too Many, Canada and the Jews of Europe, 1933 to 1948.
The story of Canada's role in the refugee crisis of the Nazi era is just an uncomfortable pair of shoes. It's just too tight and uncomfortable to walk in and defies, as I say, the kind of way Canadians want to see themselves in their past. And so Canadian immigration policy, don't mistake it for the United Way. It was ethnically selective as well as being economically self-serving. By the time we get to the late 20s and 30s, Canada, like the United States, was closing its doors to immigrants. It was the beginning of the Depression. There was a shortage of jobs. The notion was that immigrants take jobs from that are available to others. The door was gradually closing. The Canadian immigration authorities, their sole understanding of what their role was at that point was immigration restriction. And they were not going to bend. The group that was pounding on the door to get out of Europe were Jews who were looking for a safe haven, a place to go. The world was divided into two parts, that part in which the Jews dared not stay, and that part in which they were forbidden to enter. And Canada fell into that second category. One could say that in Canadian immigration policy, by the time we get to the late 30s, anti-Semitism was built into the policy itself. From the coming to power of Hitler in Germany in 1933 until after the defeat of Hitler in 1945, Canada knowingly admitted approximately 5,000 Jews, which is proportionately the lowest number of any Western liberal democracy. The object was keeping people out of Canada, not processing them to come in. And they did their job very well.
This complicated the release plans for the interned Jewish refugees at Fort Lennox.
It is no surprise that when it was discovered, in a sense, that these people that had been sent to Canada were not Nazis or whatever, the immigration authorities were at their wits' end how to respond. You couldn't just pack them up and send them back. So what do you do with them? How do you release them and not have them here? And how do you guarantee that they're going to leave the country? Because in the bottom line for the immigration authorities, it was how to get rid of them or make sure that when the war ends, they'd be gone. If Canada wasn't going to admit Jews, it wasn't going to admit them through the back door.
Despite all this, after the internees were recognized as refugees in July 1941, the federal government was obligated to work on a release plan. Eventually, refugees could be released as students, farm workers, or skilled labor for the war effort, if a Canadian family or employer agreed to sponsor them. The Immigration Department had to approve each case, so progress was slow.
They were considered temporary residents, and they were warned during this period that they would be re-interned if they broke any rules or even if they tried to switch jobs.
Erwin Schild was released in early 1942 to continue his studies at the Torah Chaim Yeshiva in Toronto.
It seemed a lot longer, incidentally. It seemed a lot longer than 2 years. But 2 years is long enough, really. You have to be a criminal with quite a crime to be incarcerated for 2 years. And he were, confined for nothing, by mistake, really, by accident.
For the internees released as students, life in Canada took some adjusting to. But for the laborers, it could be challenging. Their status in Canada relied on the goodwill of employers. So in cases of poor working conditions and exploitation, they had little power to complain.
They had to report to the RCMP on a regular basis. Some who married Canadian women found that their Canadian spouses lost their citizenship and also had to report to the RCMP. Many of the young internees desperately wanted to sign up to fight. It was still the middle of the war, but they weren't allowed to join the army.
Some older refugees found the transition very difficult.
They had to rebuild lives they had totally lost before, and many of them lost their families, and not just their parents, but their spouses and their children.
In November 1943, 3.5 years after that stormy July night, the internment camp at Fort Lennox was shuttered. The final 50 refugees, labeled as unreleasable, were sent back to Britain. In 1945, an order in council gave full immigration status to the former interned refugees.
The Canadian government was clearly aware of the Holocaust and what had happened, and allowed this small group of 996 former internees to stay.
Some returned to Europe or moved to the United States, but many stayed in Canada. Erwin Schild went on to become a much-beloved rabbi at the Adath Israel Synagogue in Toronto, where he led the congregation for more than 40 years.
The interned refugees, once they were released, made tremendous contributions to this country in the cultural, economic, technical, and educational fields.
They include 2 Nobel Prize winners in chemistry, Walter Kohn and Max Perutz, as well as composers, musicians, photojournalists, physicists, architects, cosmologists, philanthropists. The list is lengthy.
They're just a small example of what Canada could have benefited from if they had opened their doors to Jewish refugees during the Holocaust.
Decades later, visitor information at Fort Lennox mainly focused on the site's military history.
My name is Annick Guérin. I'm a team leader of visitor experience at Parks Canada. When I started working, we had one sentence to say up there used to be a refugee camp here during the Second World War. And that was it. And we would go on to another subject. We would be doing a guided tour and someone would pipe, well, I used to live here. I lived here during the Second World War. A lot of them came over with their families, and they really had this desire to share with them what they went through, where they were, and how they lived all through that experience. I must say those were the very touching meetings that we had with the former refugees. And one of the main things that they wanted to share was the fact that they were extremely lucky in their bad luck, because for them, passing through Fort Lennox was the gateway to coming to Canada. And they knew perfectly well that other people in Germany and Austria didn't have that luck to get out in time. And we really tried to convey that we were so happy to see them and so happy for them to share with us what they knew.
Parks Canada recently created a new exhibit at Fort Lennox with a section dedicated to the internees.
One very special object is a prayer book that had been shelved in our collections for over 50 years.
That prayer book, known as a siddur, was found amongst the roots of a tree during archaeological work at Fort Lennox. We spoke with Daniel Schild, Rabbi Erwin Schild's son, about the importance of the siddur.
But the daily siddur is, for a religious Jew, something he cannot leave behind or go anywhere without. Religious Jews know most of the prayers by heart, but they don't necessarily feel totally confident that they know all of them. So having a siddur, whether you're going on a trip or especially in this case where your next location is unknown, having your prayer book that you can use every day would be essential.
Daniel explained how a siddur might have ended up buried beneath a tree.
First of all, when a siddur has to be buried, it's not a happy occasion. It means that the siddur has deteriorated to the point where the name of God is being blotted out, or pages have been removed, or frayed, or otherwise damaged. Once they cannot be used, they must be preserved. The idea is to bury holy books in ground which has been consecrated for burial for Jewish people. Clearly, is not always possible. Throwing it in the garbage is not an option. We'll give the prayer book a burial by digging a shallow grave and putting prayer books or anything else which are ruined in these graves. So that's basically how a prayer book would end up in a random location where Jews live.
Parks Canada curators and conservators, in consultation with the Montreal Jewish community, decided to display the siddur as it was found, with fragments of paper interspersed between the tree roots. It's a poignant reminder of the refugees' time at Fort Lennox. There's one other place at Fort Lennox with evidence of the refugees, the staircase they built to access the second floor of the barracks. More than 80 years since the internment camp closed, it remains a tangible link between the fort's British military past and the people who spent years of their lives within these walls, separated from their families and unsure of their futures. Here's Daniel Schild.
The story is quite incredible. The absurdity of England sending and Canada accepting Jewish guys who were obviously being persecuted by the Nazis and would have been killed had they returned to Germany, and bringing them here and classifying them as an enemy alien and putting them in a separate camp with targets on their back as if they were somehow a danger to the country is a total absurdity. Whether there was an anti-Semitic undertone to this or whether it was just a matter of in wartime, rationality sometimes gets left behind and irrationality takes over. And I think that my father has proven, and these guys have proven, is we bring refugees in, many will add to and contribute to the country in ways that we cannot envision. And having refugees like my father, who became a member of the Order of Canada, to go from a refugee to a member of Order of Canada, to me, is just unthinkable.
Rabbi Erwin Schild summed up his feelings about his time at Fort Lennox in his memoir, published in 2000. We asked Daniel Schild to read it for us.
I hold no grudge against the British. They saved my life. On the whole, internment was not a very tragic experience for me. It removed me from the threat of German bombs that fell on London. Though painful, my experience of life in internment had some positive value. Above all, it brought me to Canada, all expenses paid. Canada has more than compensated me for her initial rejection and her hostile indifference to my overtures. The opportunities she eventually offered me have engendered in me a true patriot's love for her. I sing our national anthem always with deep feeling, and often with tears welling up in my eyes. To keep Canada glorious and free and united, I gladly continue to stand on guard.
Fort Lennox National Historic Site is open to visitors during the summer months. It's about an hour's drive southeast of Montreal, plus a short boat ride to Noix, which is still a great spot for a picnic. You can also learn more about the experience of interned Jewish refugees at the Montreal Holocaust Museum. ReCollections is produced by Parks Canada. A big thank you to our consulting producer, Dr. Paula Draper, and to the late Rabbi Erwin Schild, who passed away in early 2024, just 2 months shy of his 104th birthday. Thanks as well to Daniel Schild, Dr. Brigitte Violette, Annette Guérin, Dr. Harold Troper. A big thank you to both the USC Shoah Foundation and the Toronto Holocaust Museum for the oral history recordings of Rabbi Schild. For loads of extras, including a Google Arts and Culture exhibition with some great photos of the fort and the artifacts we've discussed, take a look at the show notes or visit parks.canada.ca/recollections. I'm your host, Fred Shepard. Thanks for listening. Did you know that the designation of many of Canada's national historic sites, people, and events began with a suggestion from the public? If you have a suggestion, check out the show notes or visit parks.canada.ca/commemorate for information on how to nominate a new event, person, or site that's important to the history of Canada.